Marcus Johnson checked his Uber app as he sat in his 2020 Honda Accord, parked outside a Waffle House on Peachtree Street in downtown Atlanta. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in late September, and Marcus had been driving for about 5 hours already, having started his shift at 10 p.m. He typically worked Wednesday through Saturday nights from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., finding that late night and early morning hours were consistently busy with bar closings, airport runs, hospital workers ending shifts, and various other riders needing transportation during Atlanta's overnight hours. At 44 years old, Marcus had been driving for Uber for 6 years, having started in 2018 after being laid off from a logistics coordinator position at a shipping company. What had begun as a temporary income solution while he searched for another corporate job had become his permanent employment. The flexibility appealed to Marcus. He could work when he wanted, take nights off when needed, and the income was decent if he worked the right hours in the right areas. Over 6 years, Marcus had completed more than 15,000 rides, maintained a 4.96-star rating, and earned diamond status in Uber's driver rewards program. Marcus took pride in providing excellent service to passengers. His car was always immaculately clean, with bottled water and phone chargers available for riders. He was friendly but not overly chatty, reading passengers' cues about whether they wanted conversation or silence. He knew Atlanta's streets and highways intimately, could navigate efficiently even during rush hours or when GPS failed. He made passengers feel safe, especially important for the many women who rode alone during late-night hours, and appreciated having a driver who was professional, respectful, and protective. Over 15,000 rides, Marcus had experienced nearly everything: drunk passengers, sick passengers, couples fighting, people crying about breakups or job losses, celebrities trying to travel incognito, passengers in medical emergencies, people fleeing dangerous situations. He'd returned countless forgotten items: phones, wallets, purses, laptops, even a wedding ring once. He'd dealt with difficult passengers who were rude or tried to scam him or violated Uber's policies. He'd navigated awkward situations and learned when to engage with passengers and when to maintain professional distance. But in 6 years and 15,000 rides, Marcus had never encountered a pattern quite like what he'd been observing over the past 3 weeks. His app pinged with a new ride request. Marcus glanced at the pickup location, a luxury high-rise apartment building in Midtown Atlanta, about 10 minutes from his current location. The destination was listed as a Denny's restaurant about 3 miles away. The passenger name was simply Sarah. Marcus accepted the ride and began driving toward the pickup location, navigating through the mostly empty streets of downtown Atlanta in the early morning hours. As he drove, he realized this was the same pickup location and destination he'd had multiple times over the past 3 weeks, always between 2:45 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., always with a passenger named Sarah requesting to go to the same 24-hour Denny's. This would be Marcus's 7th time picking up Sarah from that apartment building in 3 weeks. The pattern was unusual: the same passenger, the same time of night, the same route, happening repeatedly over multiple weeks. Marcus had noticed it after the 3rd pickup and had been paying closer attention since then, increasingly concerned about what might be happening with this passenger. Marcus pulled up in front of the luxury apartment building, a gleaming glass tower with a doorman, valet parking, and the kind of amenities that indicated residents were wealthy professionals. He sent the "I've arrived" notification through the app and waited. After a few minutes, a woman emerged from the building's lobby. Marcus recognized her from the previous pickups. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with shoulder-length blonde hair, wearing designer clothing that looked expensive even to Marcus's untrained eye. But despite the luxury building and expensive clothes, something about this woman immediately conveyed distress. As Sarah approached the car and opened the back door, Marcus could see even in the dim light from the building that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, mascara smudged, face blotchy. She slid into the back seat without making eye contact, clutching her designer purse against her chest like a shield. "Hi, Sarah. Heading to Denny's again tonight?" Marcus asked gently, trying to sound friendly and non-judgmental. "Yes, please. Same place as always." Sarah's voice was thick with tears, barely above a whisper. Marcus pulled away from the building and began the short drive to the Denny's. In his rear-view mirror, he could see Sarah staring out the window, tears streaming silently down her face. This was the pattern he'd observed during all 6 previous rides. Sarah getting into his car in the middle of the night, clearly having been crying, remaining silent during the short drive, getting out at Denny's and going inside alone. But tonight, Marcus noticed something he'd missed on previous rides, or perhaps it was new. As Sarah shifted in the back seat, the sleeve of her expensive blouse rode up slightly, and Marcus could see dark bruises on her wrist. Then, when passing streetlights illuminated the car interior briefly, Marcus caught sight of Sarah's face in profile. What he'd thought was just smudged makeup on her cheekbone was actually a bruise, partially covered with foundation that had worn off from crying. Marcus felt his stomach tighten with concern. This woman wasn't just upset about something, she was injured. She had bruises that suggested she'd been grabbed forcefully or struck. Combined with the pattern of calling for rides from her home at 3 a.m. repeatedly, always crying, always going to a 24-hour restaurant alone, the picture suggested something seriously wrong. Marcus had been trained by Uber on recognizing signs of human trafficking and domestic violence. Drivers were taught to watch for passengers who seemed frightened, controlled, or in distress, and to report concerns through proper channels. The training emphasized that drivers shouldn't confront suspected abusers or dangerous situations directly, but should document observations and contact law enforcement when appropriate. The signs Sarah was displaying matched several indicators of domestic violence: repeated distress, visible injuries, late-night patterns suggesting she was fleeing somewhere regularly, expensive appearance, suggesting resources but clear signs of trauma. Marcus decided he needed to say something, needed to at least offer help, even if Sarah wasn't ready to accept it. As they approached the Denny's, Marcus spoke carefully. "Sarah, I've picked you up several times now over the past few weeks. Always around the same time, always going to the same place, and I can't help but notice you seem really upset. I don't mean to pry into your business, but I want you to know if you're in some kind of trouble, if someone is hurting you, there are people who can help. I can help connect you with resources if you need them." Sarah stiffened in the back seat. For a moment, Marcus thought she might get angry at him for overstepping, but then her face crumpled and she started sobbing harder. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just don't have anywhere else to go." Marcus pulled into the Denny's parking lot, but didn't end the ride immediately. He turned in his seat to face Sarah, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. "You're not making me uncomfortable. I'm concerned about you. Those bruises on your wrist and face, did someone hurt you?" Sarah nodded, covering her face with her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs. "My husband, he gets angry. About everything, about nothing. Tonight it was because I forgot to pick up his dry cleaning. He started yelling. Then he pushed me. Then he grabbed my wrists and squeezed until I cried. Then he hit me. And then he locked me out of our apartment. He does this 3 or 4 times a week. He locks me out in the middle of the night after he hurts me. I can't get back in until morning when he's calmed down. So I call an Uber and come here and sit in Denny's until sunrise, and then I go back home and he acts like nothing happened." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, not at Sarah but at her husband, at this man who was abusing his wife and then forcing her out of their home in the middle of the night. "Sarah, what your husband is doing is domestic violence. It's assault. It's illegal. You don't have to live this way. There are shelters where you can stay safely. There are legal protections available. There are people who can help you leave this situation." "I know," Sarah whispered. "I know it's abuse. I'm not stupid. But leaving is so complicated. David, my husband, he's a vice president at a financial services company. He makes $400,000 a year. We live in a $1 million apartment. Everyone thinks we have this perfect life. His colleagues, our friends, my family, they all think David is this successful, charming, generous man. No one would believe me if I told them what he does to me behind closed doors. And David says if I try to leave him or report him to police, he'll destroy me. He'll use his money and connections to make sure I get nothing in a divorce. He'll ruin my reputation. He'll make everyone think I'm crazy or lying." This was a pattern Marcus had read about in domestic violence training: abusers who had wealth, status and community respect, using those advantages to trap victims, convincing victims that no one would believe them, that leaving would result in losing everything. It was particularly insidious because victims did have resources in terms of money and social connections, but those resources were controlled by the abuser and used as tools of control rather than as means of escape. "Sarah, there are advocates and lawyers who specialize in helping people in exactly your situation," Marcus said. Domestic violence doesn't only happen in poor families, it happens across all economic classes. The difference is that wealthy abusers have more tools to control victims and more resources to fight back legally if victims try to leave. But there are still ways to leave safely and legally. Would you be willing to talk to someone at a domestic violence organization? I can give you numbers right now. You could call from here, from this parking lot, while I wait with you. Sarah looked up, her tear-streaked face showing a mixture of hope and terror. Do you really think someone could help me, even though David has so much money and power, even though I don't have any evidence of the abuse except these bruises that will fade in a week? Yes, I really think someone can help you, Marcus said firmly. And there are ways to document the abuse even if you haven't been taking photos or keeping records, medical records if you've been treated for injuries. These Uber rides, they're documented with timestamps showing you're being kicked out of your home at 3 a.m. repeatedly. That's evidence of a pattern. Your testimony is evidence. You're not powerless here, Sarah. You're trapped right now, but there are ways out. Sarah sat silently for a long moment, weighing the decision. Finally, she nodded. Okay, yes, I'll talk to someone. I don't know if I'm ready to actually leave David tonight, but maybe talking to someone will help me figure out what to do. Marcus pulled out his phone and searched for Atlanta domestic violence hotlines. He found the Partnership Against Domestic Violence, a local organization that provided 24-hour crisis support, emergency shelter, legal advocacy, and counseling for domestic violence victims. He called the hotline number and explained briefly that he had a domestic violence victim who needed to speak with an advocate. The hotline worker said she could talk to Sarah immediately. Marcus handed his phone to Sarah, who took it with trembling hands. She stepped out of the car for privacy and walked a short distance away, talking on the phone for approximately 20 minutes. Marcus watched from the car, giving her space but staying close enough to ensure she was safe. When Sarah returned to the car, she looked exhausted, but slightly less hopeless than before. The wind toughened. The advocate said I can come to their shelter right now if I want. They have space available. I'd be safe there, and David wouldn't be able to find me. They can provide legal help and counseling, and help me figure out next steps. She said I don't have to decide tonight about divorcing David or pressing charges or anything permanent. I can just go to the shelter, be safe, and take time to think about what I want to do. Do you want to go to the shelter now? Marcus asked. Sarah hesitated, fear crossing her face. If I go now, David will realize I'm not coming back home in the morning like I usually do. He'll know something is wrong. He'll start looking for me. I'm scared of what he'll do. The shelter address is confidential, Marcus said. Your husband won't know where you are. The advocates are trained in safety planning. They'll help you figure out how to protect yourself from retaliation. And Sarah, every time you go back to David after he hurts you, you're at risk. Domestic violence escalates. It gets worse over time, not better. The next time he's angry, he might hurt you worse than bruises. I know leaving is terrifying, but staying might be more dangerous. Sarah closed her eyes, more tears squeezing out. I know you're right. I've been making excuses for 3 years, telling myself it's not that bad, that David will change, that I can manage it. But it keeps getting worse. He used to only yell, then he started pushing me, then grabbing me hard enough to leave bruises. Tonight he hit my face for the first time. What if next time he really hurts me? What if next time I end up in the hospital or dead? Marcus waited, letting Sarah process her thoughts without rushing her decision. After a long moment, Sarah spoke decisively. Take me to the shelter. I'm ready. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. Marcus entered the shelter address into his GPS. The Partnership Against Domestic Violence shelter was located in a secure facility in a confidential location in South Atlanta. The drive took about 20 minutes, and during the trip, Sarah called the hotline back to let them know she was on her way. When they arrived at the shelter, an unmarked building in a residential neighborhood with security measures visible but discreet, Marcus pulled up to the entrance. A staff member was waiting at the door, having been alerted by the hotline that Sarah was coming. Before Sarah got out of the car, she turned to Marcus. Thank you for noticing I was in trouble. Thank you for asking if I was okay instead of just ignoring it. Thank you for calling the hotline and for driving me here. You probably saved my life tonight. If you hadn't said anything, I would have gone to Denny's like I always do, sat there for 3 hours and then gone back home to David, and the abuse would have continued until eventually something really bad happened. Marcus felt emotion tighten his throat. I'm glad I could help. And Sarah, you saved your own life by being brave enough to accept help. That took incredible courage. I hope you know that. Sarah smiled weakly through her tears, then got out of the car and walked toward the shelter entrance where the staff member waited. Marcus watched until Sarah was safely inside before driving away.
As Marcus resumed his Uber shift, driving through the early morning streets of Atlanta, he felt shaken by the encounter, but also profoundly glad he'd paid attention to Sarah's pattern, that he'd asked questions instead of ignoring concerning signs, that he'd been able to connect her with resources that might help her escape an abusive situation. Over the next several days, Marcus thought often about Sarah, wondering if she'd stayed at the shelter or had returned to her husband, wondering if she was safe, hoping that his intervention had made a lasting difference. He couldn't contact her directly, he didn't have her phone number, and it would be inappropriate to reach out given the circumstances. He could only hope that she was getting the support she needed. About 2 weeks after taking Sarah to the shelter, Marcus's Uber app pinged with a ride request from a familiar location, the luxury apartment building in Midtown, where he'd picked up Sarah 7 times. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Was Sarah back with her husband? Had she left the shelter and returned to the abusive relationship, as many domestic violence victims did multiple times before finally leaving permanently? But when Marcus arrived at the building, the passenger who emerged was not Sarah but a well-dressed man in his late 30s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a briefcase. The app showed the passenger name as David M. Marcus's blood ran cold. This was Sarah's husband. This was the man who'd been beating Sarah and locking her out of their apartment in the middle of the night, and now Marcus was about to drive him somewhere. David opened the back door and got in, barely glancing at Marcus. "Airport, please. Take 75 south to Hartsfield-Jackson." Marcus confirmed the destination and began driving, his mind racing. Should he say something to this man about Sarah? Should he tell David that he knew what David had been doing to his wife? Should he refuse the ride? Marcus decided that confronting David would be inappropriate and potentially dangerous. He was a ride-share driver, not law enforcement. His role was to drive passengers safely to their destinations, not to confront abusers or put himself at risk. But Marcus also resolved to report this ride to the domestic violence advocates, letting them know that Sarah's husband was traveling, which might be important information for Sarah's safety planning. The drive to the airport took about 30 minutes. David spent the entire ride on his phone, making business calls and responding to emails, completely oblivious to Marcus, or the fact that Marcus knew his secret, knew that behind David's polished professional exterior was a man who beat his wife. Marcus studied David in the rearview mirror, noting his expensive clothes, his confident demeanor, his air of success and competence. This was what the public saw, the successful executive, the respectable businessman. No one looking at David would guess that he went home and terrorized his wife, that he physically assaulted her and then forced her out of their home in the middle of the night. This was the insidiousness of domestic violence, particularly among wealthy, educated, professional abusers. They maintained perfect public personas while committing horrific abuse in private. Their victims were trapped not just by fear and economic dependence, but by the knowledge that no one would believe that someone so successful and respected could be violent. Marcus dropped David at the airport departure area, accepted payment through the app, and watched David stride confidently into the terminal with his briefcase and his facade of normalcy intact. Then Marcus immediately called the Partnership Against Domestic Violence hotline and asked to leave a message for the advocates working with Sarah Morrison. He'd learned Sarah's last name from having David Morrison's ride on his app. Marcus explained that he was the Uber driver who'd taken Sarah to the shelter 2 weeks ago, and that he'd just driven Sarah's husband David to the airport, suggesting David would be traveling for at least several days. He thought the advocates might want to know this for safety planning purposes. If David was out of town, it might be a good time for Sarah to safely retrieve personal belongings from the apartment, or handle other logistics without risk of encountering him. The hotline worker thanked Marcus for the information and said she'd pass it along to Sarah's case manager. She also mentioned, without providing details due to confidentiality, that Sarah was still at the shelter and was working with advocates on developing a comprehensive safety plan and exploring her legal options. Marcus felt relief wash over him. Sarah hadn't returned to David. She was still at the shelter, still choosing safety over the familiar trap of her abusive marriage. That was huge. The first 2 weeks after leaving an abuser were often the most dangerous time, when victims were most likely to reconsider and return, when abusers ramped up efforts to regain control, when the challenges of starting over could feel overwhelming. Over the following months, Marcus occasionally drove David Morrison to and from the airport or to business meetings around Atlanta. Each time Marcus felt anger at having to provide service to this man who'd hurt Sarah, but he maintained his professionalism and didn't reveal that he knew anything about David's private life. Marcus also kept the domestic violence hotline informed about David's travel schedule when he could, hoping this information was helpful for Sarah's safety planning. Marcus never saw Sarah again as an Uber passenger, which he took as a positive sign. If she'd been returning to the apartment, and the pattern of being locked out in the middle of the night, he likely would have gotten ride requests from her again. Her absence suggested she'd stayed away from David and was building a new life somewhere safer. About 6 months after taking Sarah to the shelter, Marcus received an unexpected call from Detective Lisa Martinez of the Atlanta Police Department's Domestic Violence Unit. Detective Martinez explained that Sarah Morrison had filed for divorce from David Morrison and had also filed criminal charges against him for assault and battery, based on the years of documented abuse. The detective wanted to interview Marcus about what he'd observed during his rides with Sarah, the repeated pattern of picking her up at 3 a.m., her visible distress and injuries, what Sarah had disclosed to him about David's abuse. Marcus met with Detective Martinez at the police station and provided a detailed statement. He described the 7 times he'd picked up Sarah from her apartment building in the middle of the night, always finding her crying with visible bruises. He recounted the conversation where Sarah had disclosed that David beat her and locked her out of their apartment repeatedly. He explained that he'd connected Sarah with the domestic violence hotline and had driven her to the shelter. He provided his Uber records, showing the documented pattern of rides. Your observations and your willingness to ask Sarah what was happening were crucial to her being able to escape the abuse, Detective Martinez told Marcus. Many domestic violence victims suffer in silence because no one notices or no one asks. You noticed the pattern of behavior that suggested something was wrong. You asked gentle questions that gave Sarah an opening to disclose the abuse. You connected her with resources that helped her leave safely. That intervention likely saved her from escalating violence. Detective Martinez explained that Sarah Morrison's case against David Morrison was proceeding through both the criminal justice system and family court. Criminally, David was facing charges of aggravated assault and battery based on Sarah's testimony about the repeated physical abuse and the documented injuries. In family court, Sarah was seeking divorce and a permanent protective order prohibiting David from contacting her. David Morrison's defense strategy is predictable, Detective Martinez said. His attorney is arguing that Sarah is lying about the abuse to gain advantage in the divorce proceedings. They're claiming she's motivated by money and is fabricating allegations to get a larger settlement. They're pointing to David's lack of criminal history and his professional reputation as evidence that he couldn't possibly be abusive. It's the classic defense in domestic violence cases involving wealthy, respected defendants. But Detective Martinez explained that the prosecution had strong evidence supporting Sarah's allegations. Medical records documented injuries consistent with Sarah's descriptions of assault. Marcus's testimony and Uber records established a documented pattern of Sarah being forced out of her home at 3 a.m. repeatedly over weeks. Text messages between Sarah and friends referenced David's anger and walking on eggshells, though Sarah had never explicitly disclosed the physical abuse to friends before. Most importantly, Sarah herself was a compelling witness, educated, articulate, credible, with nothing to gain by lying about abuse and everything to lose in terms of exposing her private trauma publicly. The criminal trial took place approximately 1 year after Marcus had first intervened to help Sarah. Marcus was called as a witness and testified about his observations during the 7 rides he'd provided to Sarah. Her distress, her injuries, the late-night pattern, her disclosure about David's violence. He explained that he'd noticed the unusual pattern because in 6 years and 15,000 Uber rides, he'd never encountered another passenger who requested rides from their home at 3 a.m. multiple times per week, always crying, always with fresh bruises. Sarah also testified, walking the jury through the history of her relationship with David, the charming courtship, the gradual onset of control and verbal abuse, the first physical violence 2 years into their marriage, the escalating pattern of pushing, grabbing, hitting that had continued for 3 years. She described specific incidents of abuse, showed photos of injuries, explained the psychological tactics David used to prevent her from leaving, threats about ruining her reputation and financial future, isolation from friends and family, convincing her that no one would believe she was being abused because David was so successful and respected. He told me over and over that I was crazy, that I was too sensitive, that his anger was my fault because I provoked him, Sarah testified, her voice steady despite the difficulty of recounting the abuse publicly. He convinced me that if I reported him, no one would believe me because he's this successful executive with no history of violence. He said his lawyers would destroy me in court, that I'd be left with nothing. I started to believe I had no options, that I just had to endure it. But then Marcus, my Uber driver, asked if I was okay. He noticed the pattern of me calling for rides at 3 a.m. He saw my bruises. He asked gentle questions that made me realize I could ask for help. He gave me the number for the domestic violence hotline and drove me to the shelter. That was the beginning of me understanding that I wasn't trapped, that there were people who would help me, that I could escape. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. David Morrison was convicted of aggravated assault and battery. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 3 years if he completed domestic violence intervention programs while incarcerated. Sarah was in the courtroom when the sentence was read. She didn't celebrate or show satisfaction. She just sat quietly, tears streaming down her face, looking both relieved and sad. Relieved that David had been held accountable, that she'd been believed, that the jury had seen through his facade to the abuser underneath. Sad that her marriage had ended this way, that years of her life had been consumed by abuse, that she'd have to rebuild everything from scratch. After the sentencing, Sarah approached Marcus in the courthouse hallway. She looked different than she had that night at 3 a.m. in his Uber. Healthier, stronger, more confident. She wore business attire and carried herself with a composure that suggested she'd done significant healing work over the past year.
Marcus, I wanted to thank you personally, Sarah said. You noticed me when I felt invisible. You asked if I was okay when I'd convinced myself that suffering in silence was the only option. You connected me with resources that saved my life. Everything that happened after going to the shelter, working with advocates, filing for divorce, pressing charges, testifying in court, David being convicted and sentenced, all of it started because you paid attention and cared enough to help. Marcus felt emotional. I'm so glad I asked. I'm so glad you had the courage to accept help and to leave. And I'm glad David was held accountable for what he did to you.
Sarah nodded. Me too. It's been the hardest year of my life, living in a shelter, going through a divorce, testifying at trial, dealing with people who didn't believe me or thought I was motivated by money. But I'm free now. David can't hurt me anymore. I have a protective order. He's in prison. I'm rebuilding my life on my own terms. I got a job working for a non-profit that helps domestic violence survivors. I want to help other women the way advocates helped me. I'm living in a small apartment instead of a luxury penthouse, but it's mine, and it's safe, and I can sleep at night without fear. That's worth more than any amount of money. Sarah reached out and hugged Marcus. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for caring. Thank you for taking action instead of looking away. You're a hero, Marcus. Not just to me, but to every person who learns from my story that domestic violence can happen to anyone, that it's not always visible to outsiders, and that asking questions and offering help can save lives. Marcus hugged Sarah back, feeling grateful that his observation and intervention had contributed to her escape from years of abuse. You're the hero of your own story, Marcus told her. You're the one who had the courage to leave, to testify, to rebuild. I just helped connect you with resources. You did all the hard work. The case generated significant media coverage in Atlanta, with news outlets running stories about the successful executive convicted of domestic violence against his wife. The coverage highlighted several important aspects of the case that challenged common misconceptions about domestic violence. Sarah and David Morrison were wealthy, educated, professional people living in a luxury apartment in one of Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhoods. David had a prestigious job and a public reputation as a successful, respectable businessman. This challenged the stereotype that domestic violence only happened in poor or uneducated families. Second, the case showed how wealth could be used as a tool of control and intimidation by abusers. David had threatened to use his financial resources and legal connections to destroy Sarah if she tried to leave or report the abuse. He'd convinced her that his money and status made him untouchable, that no one would believe her allegations against such a successful man. These tactics trapped Sarah as effectively as physical force. Third, the case highlighted the importance of outside observers noticing patterns of abuse and offering help. Sarah had been suffering in silence for 3 years, unable to see a way out of the situation. Marcus's observation of her repeated 3 a.m. rides, his recognition of warning signs, and his willingness to ask caring questions had created an opening for Sarah to disclose the abuse and accept help. The media coverage included interviews with domestic violence experts who emphasized that abuse in wealthy families often went undetected because victims and abusers were good at maintaining public facades, because affluent victims had more to lose, socially and financially, by disclosing abuse, and because people assumed wealth protected people from problems like domestic violence. Domestic violence doesn't discriminate by income level, explained Maria Rodriguez, director of the Partnership Against Domestic Violence, in one news interview. We serve victims from all backgrounds, from homeless women to wealthy professionals like Sarah Morrison. The dynamics of abuse are similar across economic classes, but wealthy abusers have additional tools to control victims: money, social status, connections, expensive lawyers. That's why it's crucial for people like Marcus Johnson, the Uber driver who noticed Sarah's pattern and helped her, to pay attention to warning signs, regardless of how put together someone appears on the surface. The media coverage also highlighted Marcus's role in the case, with several outlets interviewing him about how he'd noticed Sarah's pattern and decided to intervene. Marcus was uncomfortable with being labeled a hero, but used the attention to emphasize the importance of people in service jobs paying attention to customers or clients who might be in distress. "I'm just an Uber driver doing my job," Marcus told reporters. "But my job puts me in contact with people at vulnerable moments, late at night, when they're alone, when their guards might be down. I've driven 15,000 rides over 6 years, and I've learned to notice patterns. When I saw the same woman requesting rides at 3 a.m. multiple times, always crying, always with fresh bruises, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't ignore that, so I asked if she was okay and offered to help connect her with resources. That's all I did, noticed a pattern and offered help. Sarah is the one who had the courage to accept that help and leave an abusive situation. Marcus's story resonated with other rideshare drivers and service workers who found themselves in positions to observe customers' behavior patterns. Uber and other rideshare companies used Marcus's case as a training example, developing enhanced protocols for drivers to recognize signs of domestic violence, human trafficking, and other dangerous situations. The training emphasized specific warning signs Marcus had noticed with Sarah: passengers requesting rides at unusual hours repeatedly, passengers showing visible distress or injuries, passengers whose behavior suggested they were fleeing dangerous situations, patterns of rides that didn't make logical sense, like going to a restaurant at 3 a.m. and staying there for hours. The training taught drivers to ask caring questions when they noticed concerning patterns, to provide information about resources like domestic violence hotlines, and to report concerns to law enforcement when appropriate. Uber also implemented features in the app designed to enhance safety for both passengers and drivers. This included a discreet check-on-me feature that allowed passengers to share their location with trusted contacts if they felt unsafe, a quick access button to call 911 directly from the app, and enhanced verification systems to ensure that drivers and passengers were who they claimed to be. Over the next several years, the training based on Marcus's case and the enhanced safety features led to dozens of documented interventions where rideshare drivers noticed passengers in distress and connected them with help. A Lyft driver in Chicago noticed a teenage girl who seemed frightened of the man who'd ordered the ride for her and discreetly gave the girl a domestic violence hotline card, leading to the girl escaping a trafficking situation. An Uber driver in Phoenix noticed a passenger with bruises requesting rides to a hospital multiple times and reported concerns to hospital social workers, leading to intervention for an abusive relationship. A rideshare driver in Seattle noticed a passenger repeatedly going to the same house at odd hours and appearing increasingly distressed, reported the pattern to police, and investigation revealed a sexual assault situation. Each of these interventions traced back to the awareness and training that Marcus's experience with Sarah Morrison had helped generate. His decision to pay attention to Sarah's pattern, to ask caring questions, to connect her with resources that had created ripples that extended far beyond one domestic violence case in Atlanta. Marcus continued driving for Uber, now with an even more heightened awareness of passengers who might be in distress. He kept business cards from domestic violence organizations, human trafficking hotlines, and mental health crisis services in his car, discreetly available for passengers who might need them. He'd developed a reputation among advocates and law enforcement in Atlanta as someone who paid attention and was willing to help when he noticed concerning situations. He also became involved in community education about domestic violence, speaking at events about how people in everyday service jobs could recognize and respond to signs of abuse. He emphasized that domestic violence victims came from all backgrounds and that wealth didn't protect people from abuse, it just meant abusers had more resources to use as tools of control. Sarah Morrison lived in a $1 million apartment and wore designer clothes, Marcus told audiences. From the outside, her life looked perfect, but she was being beaten by her husband multiple times per week and was so trapped by his threats and control that she couldn't see a way out. The only reason I knew something was wrong was because I noticed a pattern, the same woman calling for rides at 3 a.m. repeatedly, always crying, always bruised. Most people never saw Sarah's suffering because she and David maintained a perfect public facade. That's how domestic violence works in wealthy families. The abuse happens behind closed doors and victims are trapped by shame, fear, and abusers' threats about what will happen if they tell anyone. Marcus's presentations resonated particularly with service workers, hotel staff, restaurant servers, retail employees, delivery drivers, anyone whose job put them in regular contact with the public. He encouraged them to trust their instincts when something seemed off about a customer's situation, to ask gentle questions, to provide information about resources, and to report concerns when appropriate. You don't need to be a social worker or law enforcement officer to help someone in crisis, Marcus told audiences. You just need to notice when something seems wrong, care enough to ask if someone needs help, and know how to connect people with resources. Those simple actions can save lives. 5 years after Marcus had first taken Sarah to the domestic violence shelter, he was invited to speak at a national conference on domestic violence prevention. The conference brought together advocates, law enforcement, healthcare providers, legal professionals, and others working to address intimate partner violence.
Marcus's presentation, titled Recognizing Domestic Violence During Everyday Interactions, an Uber driver's story, drew one of the largest audiences at the conference. Marcus walked the attendees through his experience with Sarah, noticing the pattern of 3 a.m. rides, recognizing the warning signs of abuse, deciding to ask caring questions, connecting Sarah with the hotline, driving her to the shelter. He explained how his training from Uber and his own observational skills had helped him identify a situation where a woman needed help but couldn't ask for it directly. Domestic violence victims often can't ask for help openly, Marcus explained. They're controlled by abusers who monitor their communications, threaten retaliation if they reach out to authorities, and have convinced them that no one will believe them or help them. Sarah couldn't call a domestic violence hotline from her apartment because David might find the call in her phone records. She couldn't tell friends or family because David had isolated her and convinced her they wouldn't believe her. But she could call an Uber at 3 a.m. when David locked her out. And when I noticed the pattern and asked caring questions, that created a safe opening for her to disclose the abuse and accept help. Marcus emphasized that the key to his intervention had been paying attention to patterns over time, rather than just individual interactions. If I'd only picked up Sarah once, I might not have realized something was seriously wrong. She was crying and had bruises, but maybe I would have thought she'd had a bad night or gotten in a fight with someone. But when I picked her up 7 times over 3 weeks, always at the same time, always from the same location, always crying with fresh bruises, always going to the same 24-hour restaurant, that pattern told me this wasn't a one-time bad situation. This was an ongoing problem. That's when I knew I needed to say something. During the Q&A session, an audience member who worked as a domestic violence advocate asked Marcus what advice he'd give to other service workers who might encounter abuse victims but weren't sure how to approach the situation. Marcus thought carefully before responding. I'd say trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about someone's situation, if they seem frightened or hurt or trapped, there's probably a reason you're feeling that way. Don't dismiss your concerns as none of your business or assume someone else will help. Ask gentle, caring questions. Are you okay? Is someone hurting you? Can I help you connect with resources? Those simple questions can open the door for someone to ask for help and have information available, phone numbers for hotlines, names of organizations, knowledge of how to report concerns to authorities. You don't have to solve the person's whole problem. You just have to notice they're in trouble and help connect them with people who can provide comprehensive assistance. Another audience member, a law enforcement officer, asked Marcus if he'd ever had concerns that confronting Sarah's husband David during one of the airport rides might have put Sarah in more danger. Absolutely. I was concerned about that, Marcus acknowledged. That's why I never said anything to David about Sarah or about knowing what he'd been doing to her. Confronting an abuser directly can escalate the danger for the victim. It can make the abuser more violent or more determined to control the victim. My role as an Uber driver wasn't to confront David or try to change his behavior. My role was to help Sarah access resources and make her own decisions about her safety. I did report David's travel schedule to the domestic violence advocates, so Sarah could use those times when he was out of town to safely handle logistics like getting belongings from the apartment. But I never confronted him directly, and I think that was the right call for Sarah's safety. The conference presentation was well received, with many attendees approaching Marcus afterward to thank him for sharing his story and to discuss how similar observation and intervention strategies could be implemented in their communities. Several organizations asked Marcus if they could use his story in their training materials for professionals and community members. Marcus agreed, understanding that the more widely his story was shared, the more people might learn to recognize domestic violence signs and offer help to victims. Over the following years, his story was featured in training programs for rideshare drivers, hotel workers, restaurant staff, healthcare providers, and various other professionals who might encounter domestic violence victims during their work.
Sarah Morrison also became involved in domestic violence advocacy, though she was more private about it than Marcus. She'd been hired by the Partnership Against Domestic Violence, the same organization that had helped her when she'd fled to their shelter, and worked as a peer support specialist, helping other survivors navigate the process of leaving abusive relationships and rebuilding their lives. Sarah's role involved meeting with newly sheltered women, sharing her own story of surviving abuse by a wealthy, respected abuser, providing emotional support and practical guidance about legal processes and safety planning, and demonstrating through her own recovery that it was possible to escape and build a healthy, independent life after abuse. When I meet with a new survivor, especially someone from a wealthy or professional background, I can tell them, "I've been where you are," Sarah explained during a staff meeting at the organization. I was married to a man who made $400,000 a year, who lived in a luxury apartment, who everyone thought was wonderful, but behind closed doors he beat me multiple times per week for 3 years. I felt trapped by his threats about what would happen if I left. I thought no one would believe me because David was so successful and respected, but I was wrong. When I reached out for help, people believed me, advocates helped me, the justice system worked. David was convicted and sent to prison. I survived. I rebuilt my life. I'm proof that wealth doesn't protect abusers forever, and that victims from any background can escape and recover. Sarah found deep fulfillment in the work, using her traumatic experience to help others who were facing similar situations. She particularly focused on helping affluent victims who struggled with the unique challenges of leaving wealthy abusers, concerns about losing financial security, shame about admitting abuse was happening in an apparently privileged life, fear of abusers' resources and legal connections, isolation from social networks that admired the abuser. Domestic violence in wealthy families looks different in some ways, Sarah told the survivors she mentored. The abuse happens in luxury apartments instead of modest homes. The abuser might be a corporate executive instead of someone without a college degree, but the core dynamics are the same: power and control, threats and intimidation, isolation and manipulation, and the path to freedom is the same: recognizing the abuse, reaching out for help, developing a safety plan, leaving when it's safe to do so, accessing support services, rebuilding your life. Your husband's money and status don't make you less deserving of help or less able to escape. You can leave, you can survive, you can thrive. 10 years after Marcus had first noticed Sarah's pattern and driven her to safety, he received an invitation to a special event hosted by the Partnership Against Domestic Violence. The organization was celebrating its 30th anniversary and honoring community members who'd made significant contributions to protecting domestic violence victims and preventing abuse. Marcus attended the event, which was held at a hotel ballroom in Atlanta. He was surprised when he was called to the stage and presented with an award recognizing his role in Sarah Morrison's case and his ongoing advocacy work educating the community about domestic violence. Marcus Johnson exemplifies what we hope all community members will do: pay attention to people who might be suffering, ask caring questions, connect victims with resources, and continue to advocate for awareness and prevention, said Maria Rodriguez, the organization's director, as she presented the award. His observation of a pattern in his Uber rides, his willingness to ask Sarah Morrison if she needed help, and his action in connecting her with our crisis hotline and driving her to safety saved Sarah's life and led to the conviction of a dangerous abuser. Marcus's story has been shared in training programs nationwide, teaching thousands of service workers how to recognize and respond to domestic violence. He's made an immeasurable contribution to protecting vulnerable people. As Marcus accepted the award, he looked out at the audience and saw Sarah Morrison sitting in the front row, smiling and applauding. She looked healthy and confident, completely transformed from the frightened, bruised woman who'd climbed into his Uber at 3 a.m. 10 years earlier. "Thank you for this honor," Marcus said, "but I want to be clear. I'm not a hero. I'm an Uber driver who paid attention and asked questions. The real heroes are the advocates who staff crisis hotlines at 3 a.m., who run emergency shelters, who provide legal assistance and counseling, who help survivors rebuild their lives. The real heroes are the survivors themselves, people like Sarah Morrison, who find the courage to leave abusive situations, to testify in court, to rebuild their lives, and to help other survivors find their own paths to freedom. I just noticed a pattern and offered help. The advocates and survivors did all the hard work." Marcus gestured to Sarah in the audience. "Sarah, would you like to come up here? Your story is as much a part of this award as mine." Sarah came to the stage, and she and Marcus stood together as the audience applauded. Sarah spoke briefly, thanking Marcus for noticing her suffering and helping her escape, thanking the organization for providing shelter and support, and encouraging other domestic violence victims in the audience to reach out for help. "I know how hard it is to leave," Sarah said. "I know the fear and the shame and the feeling that you're trapped with no way out. But I'm proof that escape is possible. Help is available. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to live without fear. And there are people like Marcus who will notice your suffering even when you think you're invisible. People who will help even when you think no one cares. Please, if you're being abused, reach out. Call the hotline, go to a shelter, tell someone what's happening. Don't suffer in silence like I did for 3 years. You're worth saving. Your life matters. And there are people ready to help you." The event concluded with a reception where Marcus and Sarah spent time talking with other survivors, advocates, and community members.
Multiple people approached Marcus to share their own stories. A hotel manager who'd noticed a guest showing signs of abuse and connected her with resources. A restaurant server who'd given a customer a domestic violence hotline card after overhearing a concerning phone conversation. A taxi driver who'd called police when a passenger seemed to be in immediate danger. Each story reinforced the importance of community members being observant and willing to help. Marcus also spoke with several Uber and Lyft drivers who'd attended the event specifically to meet him and learn more about recognizing signs of abuse among passengers. They asked for practical advice about what to do if they noticed concerning patterns or behavior. Marcus shared what he'd learned. Pay attention to passengers who seem frightened, injured, or overly controlled. Notice patterns. The same person repeatedly requesting rides at odd hours. Passengers who seem to be fleeing dangerous situations. People who disclose concerning information about their home situations. Ask gentle, caring questions when something seems wrong. Have resources available. Keep domestic violence hotline numbers saved in your phone. Know the locations of emergency shelters. Understand how to report concerns to authorities. Trust your instincts. And remember that offering help doesn't mean you have to solve the person's whole problem. Sometimes just asking, "Are you okay?" and providing a phone number for a hotline is enough to help someone take the first step towards safety. 15 years after Marcus had first driven Sarah to safety, the impact of that intervention continued to expand. Marcus was now 59 years old, still driving part-time for Uber, but also working as a consultant and trainer for rideshare companies, developing safety protocols and training programs for drivers on recognizing passengers in distress. He'd trained thousands of drivers across multiple companies and cities, spreading the message that drivers were uniquely positioned to notice vulnerable passengers and connect them with help. Sarah was now 49 years old, the director of survivor services at the Partnership Against Domestic Violence, supervising a team of advocates and peer support specialists who worked with hundreds of survivors annually. She'd helped more than 1,000 women escape abusive relationships during her 15-year career, using her own experience to provide hope and practical guidance to others facing similar situations. She'd also become a sought-after speaker on domestic violence in affluent communities, helping audiences understand that wealth didn't prevent abuse, and that victims from privileged backgrounds faced unique challenges in escaping. Her presentations challenged stereotypes about what domestic violence looked like and emphasized the importance of believing victims regardless of their economic status. "When I tell people I was married to a man who made $400,000 a year and beat me regularly, I sometimes see skepticism," Sarah said during one presentation. "People have trouble believing that domestic violence happens in luxury apartments, that successful executives abuse their spouses, that wealth doesn't protect people from intimate partner violence. But the statistics don't lie. Domestic violence occurs across all socioeconomic levels at similar rates. The difference is that wealthy victims are less likely to report the abuse, less likely to seek help from shelters or social services, more likely to be isolated by shame and fear of losing their lifestyle. And wealthy abusers have more resources to control victims and fight back legally if victims try to leave. That's why awareness is so important. We need to recognize that the woman in designer clothes crying in an Uber at 3 a.m. might be a domestic violence victim. We need to look beyond appearances and pay attention to signs of distress regardless of someone's apparent privilege. David Morrison, Sarah's ex-husband, had been released from prison after serving 3.5 years of his 5-year sentence. He was required to complete domestic violence intervention programming, maintain a permanent restraining order prohibiting contact with Sarah, and remain on probation for 5 years. He'd lost his high-paying executive position, filed for bankruptcy after legal fees and divorce settlement costs, and reportedly moved to another state to rebuild his life away from Atlanta, where his conviction was public knowledge. Sarah had mixed feelings about David's release. "I'm glad he served time in prison for what he did to me," she told Marcus during one of their periodic coffee meetups. "He was held accountable, the justice system worked, but I also know that prison doesn't magically transform abusers into non-violent people. David completed the required programs, but I don't know if he genuinely changed or just learned what facilitators wanted to hear. Part of me hopes he did change, that he understands now what he did was wrong and won't hurt anyone else. But another part of me worries about his next partner, if he has one. Will he abuse her too? Will the cycle continue?" Marcus understood Sarah's ambivalence. "You can't control what David does going forward. All you can control is your own safety and your own choices. You left. You protected yourself. You rebuilt your life. You're helping hundreds of other women do the same. That's your victory, regardless of whether David ever genuinely changes." Sarah nodded. "You're right. I can't spend my life worrying about David or monitoring whether he's abusing someone else. I have a restraining order. He's prohibited from contacting me. I've moved on with my life. I'm safe. I'm happy. I'm doing meaningful work. That's what matters. The conversation reflected the reality that domestic violence intervention and prevention were ongoing challenges. Holding individual abusers accountable through criminal prosecution was important, but couldn't address all the systemic and cultural factors that enabled domestic violence. Changing social norms around gender, power and relationships, providing better economic security for women, improving access to mental health and substance abuse treatment, teaching healthy relationship skills, creating strong community support systems, all of these broader efforts were necessary to truly prevent domestic violence rather than just responding after abuse had already occurred. But Marcus and Sarah both understood that systemic change happened slowly, while individual interventions could have immediate impact. Marcus had noticed one woman in crisis and helped her escape. That hadn't solved the broader problem of domestic violence, but it had saved Sarah's life and had created ripples that helped many others. Sometimes that was enough. One person helping another, one observation leading to intervention, one pattern noticed and acted upon. 20 years after Marcus had first driven Sarah to safety, he attended her wedding. Sarah had met someone, a kind, gentle man who worked as a teacher and treated her with respect and equality. Their relationship was healthy and loving, the complete opposite of Sarah's marriage to David. Marcus watched Sarah exchange vows with her new husband, saw the joy and peace on her face, and felt profound satisfaction knowing that he'd played a small role in making this moment possible. "If you hadn't noticed me that night, 20 years ago," Sarah told Marcus at the wedding reception, "I might not be alive today. David's violence was escalating. The next beating could have killed me. But you noticed I was in trouble. You asked if I needed help. You connected me with resources. You saved my life, Marcus. And because you saved me, I've been able to help save hundreds of other women. Every person I've helped is part of your legacy too. This wedding, this new chapter of my life, this happiness I'm feeling, it all exists because you paid attention and cared."
Marcus hugged Sarah, feeling emotional. "I'm so happy for you. You deserve all the joy and peace in the world, and I'm grateful I was in the right place at the right time to help you when you needed it." As Marcus drove home from the wedding that evening, navigating the familiar streets of Atlanta, he thought about the journey that had started 20 years ago when he'd noticed a pattern in his Uber rides. One woman requesting rides at 3 a.m. repeatedly. One observation, one question, one connection to resources, one drive to a shelter. From that simple sequence of events had come so much: Sarah's escape and recovery, David's conviction and imprisonment, training programs that taught thousands of service workers to recognize abuse, policy changes at rideshare companies that enhanced passenger safety, advocacy work that helped hundreds of domestic violence survivors, awareness campaigns that challenged stereotypes about abuse in wealthy families. Marcus had completed more than 25,000 Uber rides over his 20-year career. Most were routine, getting passengers from point A to point B safely and efficiently. But scattered among those 25,000 rides were moments where observation and caring had made profound differences. Sarah was the most significant of those moments, but there had been others: a passenger fleeing a human trafficking situation, a teenager escaping an abusive home, an elderly person being exploited by a caregiver. Each time, Marcus had noticed concerning patterns, had asked caring questions, had connected people with resources. That was the power of paying attention. That was the importance of caring about people beyond just providing a service transaction. That was why work that seemed mundane, driving people around a city, actually mattered in ways that extended far beyond transportation. Marcus would continue driving, continue paying attention, continue being willing to help when he noticed someone in crisis. Because somewhere in Atlanta, there was probably another Sarah, another person suffering in silence, trapped in an abusive situation, waiting for someone to notice their distress and offer help. Marcus would be ready to be that someone, just as he'd been ready 20 years ago when a crying woman with bruises had climbed into his Uber at 3 a.m. One observation, one question, one offer of help. That was all it took to save a life, and that was everything.
Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.